The experts threw everything they had at it. Burkina Faso's government rolled out a national campaign to plant trees across 8,000 villages. International aid dollars poured into the Sahel throughout the early 1980s. Agronomists, engineers, and development consultants arrived carrying seedlings, irrigation blueprints, and multi-year recovery plans. The total bill climbed into the tens of millions, and nearly every seedling died. The trees were not the issue, the ground was. Years of drought and sun had fused the soil into something more like pottery than dirt. Locals had a name for this iron-hard surface layer, zippele. And when rain finally arrived, it struck that crust and slid right off the edge of every field like water running down a sheet of metal. Nothing penetrated, nothing stayed. The land was not simply dry, it was locked. So when Yacouba Sawadogo walked into the fields outside Gourga carrying nothing but a traditional handpick called a daba and began punching holes into ground as hard as stone, nobody paid attention. Government officials did not schedule a visit, the engineers did not write it down. His own neighbors figured he had lost his senses. They gathered along the edges of his plot and watched him chip pit after pit into earth that agricultural agencies had officially written off as dead. They shook their heads, one man chopping holes in the desert in the middle of a drought. 2 decades later, those same experts returned to document what Sawadogo had created. In a place where every institutional effort had collapsed, he had coaxed a 40-hectare forest out of ground that agronomists had declared beyond saving. By the late 1970s, the Sahel was unraveling. This narrow ribbon of semi-arid land stretches across Africa just south of the Sahara. It was never technically desert, but during those years it was turning into one. The droughts that gripped the region from 1972 to 1984 ranked among the most devastating in its recorded history, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and setting off one of the century's worst famines. The land did not merely dry up, it underwent a physical change. In Yacouba province, in Burkina Faso's north, the combined pressure of overgrazing, persistent drought, and repeated crop failure scoured the topsoil clean. With no roots anchoring it, that thin, fertile layer lifted off on the wind. What was left underneath was a dense, iron-heavy subsoil called laterite. Under the dry season sun, the surface of that laterite fused into a shell hard enough to turn back a nail. When rain arrived, it had nowhere to go. It struck the crust, sheeted across the surface, dragging whatever loose soil remained, and disappeared into gullies and empty riverbeds. The ground was not just getting less water, it was physically throwing away every drop it received. The water table fell so far that village wells across parts of the region ran dry for as long as 8 months each year. Farmers whose families had grown sorghum and millet on these same fields for generations watched their harvests shrink to almost nothing. In the hardest hit zones, grain production fell to roughly 125 kilograms per hectare, and on the worst ground, output dropped to zero. Entire villages emptied out. Across Burkina Faso's central and northern provinces, the collapse of productive land drove one of the country's largest waves of internal migration, as Mossi, farming families, abandoned the northern plateau in large numbers and headed south searching for soil that could still grow food. The landscape they left behind was formally labeled by agricultural agencies as barren and unrecoverable. The government's tree planting campaign was supposed to reverse all of this. The thinking was straightforward. Plant trees. The trees stabilize the soil retains water, and the land heals. But that logic missed a step. You cannot plant trees in something that behaves like concrete. The seedlings were pushed into unbroken laterite crust, and the crust spat them back out. Without water soaking deep enough to sustain roots through the dry months, the saplings withered. The program planted. The program watched its seedlings die. The program filed its reports and moved along. International bodies followed with their own strategies. Irrigation networks were funded and constructed. Pumps were installed. Fertilizer was handed out. Every intervention targeted a single variable, while the core problem, the sealed skin of the land itself, went entirely unaddressed. The pumps failed and no one returned to repair them. Irrigation channels clogged with sediment. Fertilizer boosted one season's harvest and then washed off with the next rains because there was no soil structure left to anchor it. Across the region, these programs burned through millions and delivered results that were, at best, short-lived and at worst, invisible. The crisis was serious enough that in 1977, the United Nations convened its first ever conference on desertification in Nairobi, called specifically because of what was unfolding across the Sahel. The international community acknowledged that something was breaking down at a fundamental level. The studies were rigorous, the documentation was thorough, the conclusion was unanimous. The land was deteriorating faster than any program could repair it. The experts had not failed for lack of the right ambition. They had failed because they were treating symptoms instead of the disease. The symptom was the dying crops and the withered trees. The disease was the crust. And across all the programs, all the funding, and all the consultants' assessments, no one had devised a practical way to crack that crust open and teach the ground to absorb water again. Sawadogo had no scientific training. He had never studied agriculture at a university. He had grown up in Gourga, working the same land his father and grandfather had worked before him. He had listened to older villagers describe a technique called zai, an ancient planting method that had mostly been abandoned because during the better years, there was no reason to use it. It was seen as a measure of last resort, something for people who had run out of alternatives. In Moray, the Mossi language spoken locally, zai derives from zayagre, which translates roughly to get up early and hurry to prepare your land. Not exactly an inspiring sales pitch. The concept was basic. Dig a hole, drop organic material into it, plant your seed inside. The pit catches whatever rain lands on the field, funnels it toward the roots, and gives the plant enough moisture to survive even when the surrounding earth is completely parched. But Sawadogo did not simply dust off the old method, he redesigned it. He scaled up the pits. The traditional zai holes were small and shallow. Sawadogo carved his to 20, 30 centimeters wide and 10, 20 centimeters deep, spacing them roughly 70, 80 centimeters apart. At that density across a single hectare, the pattern produced around 10,000 individual pits. He also broke from convention in another fundamental way. Standard practice throughout Burkina Faso was to leave fields untouched until the rains arrived. Sawadogo started preparing his land during the dry season, months ahead of any rainfall, packing a generous handful of compost or dry organic waste into each pit while the ground was still rock hard. What happened next was something the government programs had entirely overlooked. The organic material drew in termites, specifically a type called trinervitermes, common throughout the Sahel. These are not the termites that destroy buildings. They feed on organic matter. And when Sawadogo loaded 10,000 pits across his field with compost during the dry months, he was essentially baiting 10,000 traps. The termites arrived to feed, and as they fed, they excavated. They bored networks of tunnels straight through the laterite crust, through the very layer that had been repelling water for over a decade. Every tunnel became a pathway. Every pathway became a drain. When the rains came, water hit the surface of Sawadogo's field. And instead of sliding off, it dropped into the pits and then drained through the termite channels, racing down through the crust and deep into the subsoil where roots could actually access it. He had not tried to overpower the sealed ground. He had recruited biology to unlock it from within. What was happening underground was just as dramatic as what was visible on the surface. In zones where the method took root and spread, the water table started climbing back. Wells that had been running dry for months began holding water straight through the dry season. Measurements collected between the mid-1980s and 2009 recorded the water table in treated areas, rising by an average of 5 meters, with the strongest performing sites showing gains of up to 17 meters. The crust had not only been choking the crops, it had been cutting off the entire water system beneath the land, and breaking it open transformed the hydrology of the ground itself. Then came the stones, rows of fist-sized rocks arranged along the natural contour of the slope, following its curve to slow surface water before it could escape the field. These stone rows, called cordon pierreux, required no heavy equipment and no technical expertise, just time and labor. Together, the pits, the compost, the termites, and the stone rows formed a linked water management system that captured every drop of rain the sky delivered. The neighbors found the whole thing ridiculous. The engineers, when word reached them, were unmoved. Where was the infrastructure? Where was the technology? You could not reverse desertification with pits and rocks. Sawadogo continued digging. He began planting native trees alongside his sorghum and millet, working them into the pit system so that the same water harvesting mechanism fed the trees alongside the grain. He was not just producing food, he was assembling a forest. And then someone set it on fire. Who exactly torched Sawadogo's early forest remains unclear, but the motive was no mystery. People in the village believed what he was doing was reckless, that he was upending traditions, squandering land, and making everyone around him look idle by comparison. The blaze wiped out years of early progress. He surveyed what was left. He picked up his daba and started over. For years, Sawadogo's field looked like a man slowly losing his grip, one hole at a time. But gradually, the proof piled up. During the drought of 1990, when virtually every untreated plot in the surrounding area yielded zero grain, Sawadogo's zai fields produced sorghum. Farmers who had mocked him stood in their own barren fields and stared across at his. He had actually started organizing market days as far back as 1984, years before that drought vindicated his approach. They began as modest gatherings on his land in Gourga, but steadily grew in size. Twice a year, farmers from across the region came to observe the technique, swap seeds, and learn. Sawadogo ran them on a deliberate schedule. The first event of the year fell shortly after the harvest, when farmers brought samples of the varieties they had cultivated in their zai pits. He stored those seeds in a bank at his homestead. The second event arrived just ahead of the rainy season, when farmers could choose species and varieties suited to the improved growing conditions their pits had produced. By the mid-1990s, people from over 100 villages were traveling to attend. The method was spreading farmer to farmer with no government program behind it, no consultant coordinating it, and no budget supporting it. It moved for one reason: it worked. And in the Sahel, something that actually works is the most convincing advertisement there is. The reach crossed national borders without any official initiative pushing it. In 1989, 13 farmers from Niger's Tahua region visited Sawadogo's plots at Gourga. They returned home and started rehabilitating degraded land using the same approach. That single trip planted the seed for the technique's adoption across Niger, where it has since expanded across vast stretches of damaged ground entirely under its own momentum. The water table beneath zai-treated land was recovering. Wells that had gone dry for most of the year were now holding water year-round. The trees Sawadogo had planted among his crops were doing exactly what the government campaigns had always envisioned but never achieved. Their roots were reaching down into the rebounding subsoil, drawing up moisture and releasing it back into the atmosphere above the field. The air over treated land was measurably different from the air over untreated land beside it. The restored plots were cooler. The humidity was slightly higher. They were starting to generate their own local weather patterns. The government had poured in millions. The international programs had spent even more. And here was a single farmer with a handpick and 10,000 holes per hectare, delivering what the consultants could not. The engineers showed up. The researchers showed up. The documentary crews showed up. A 2010 film titled "The Man Who Stopped the Desert" brought worldwide attention to what Sawadogo had accomplished. The Burkina Faso government, which had once classified his land as barren and unrecoverable, eventually moved to protect the forest with a formal perimeter fence. The country's Minister of Environment was present at its opening ceremony in 2021. The institutions that had once declined to fund him now cited his work in their own restoration guides. The man they had dismissed as a fool received the Right Livelihood Award in 2018, often called the Alternative Nobel Prize. In 2020, the United Nations Environment Program granted him its Champions of the Earth Award, the highest environmental distinction the United Nations bestows. He earned both honors for achieving something with a daba and handfuls of compost that no funded initiative had managed to accomplish with millions of dollars. What Sawadogo constructed at Gourga now stands as a 40-hectare forest on land that was formerly classified as barren and beyond recovery. On satellite images, you can pick it out instantly. A sharp green mass anchored in the landscape, hemmed in on all sides by the brown of untreated ground. The contrast is impossible to miss. It looks as though someone pressed a green thumbprint onto the earth. The numbers fill in the rest. In Niger's Ilela district, grain yields on untreated fields averaged around 125 kilograms per hectare over a 6-year span. On fields using pits loaded with compost, yields climbed above 500 kilograms per hectare. In a drought year, the gap widens even further. The untreated field delivers nothing. The field still puts food on the table. The method has now traveled across a 6,000-kilometer band of Africa. By 2016, alone had restored the productive capacity of tens of thousands of hectares in just 2 of Burkina Faso's northern provinces. The experts declared that the soil had crossed the point of no return. Study after study confirmed it. The government programs reinforced it with their own failures. A single farmer, with no formal training, no outside funding, and no patience for what the textbooks insisted, went out into that dead ground with a handpick and proved every one of them wrong. The funded initiatives had institutional backing, technical resources, and the full confidence of the scientific establishment behind them. They had irrigation hardware, nursery-raised seedlings, and consultant-designed frameworks. They failed across the board. Sawadogo had a daba, knowledge ancient enough to have been nearly forgotten, and a flat refusal to believe the land was finished. He succeeded. The stone rows required no engineering degree. The pits required no machinery. The termites did not submit an invoice. Ancient methods are not automatically superior to modern ones, but the people closest to a problem frequently understand it more deeply than outside consultants ever will. Those who have lived on the land for generations, carrying knowledge inherited from ancestors who weathered similar crises, bring something that no 5-year program can reproduce. Sawadogo did not create He recovered it, improved it, and then spent decades demonstrating it at scale on a landscape that every outside measurement had declared finished. If you want to understand how scorched ground comes back to life, look at Gourga. Look at a 40-hectare forest that emerged from Earth agronomists called unrecoverable. On satellite imagery, there is a visible boundary between the treated land and everything around it. On one side, green, on the other, brown. That line is not a feature of geography. It is the distance between accepting what the experts concluded and refusing to listen. If you want to see more stories where the overlooked answer outperformed the expensive one, that is exactly what this channel covers.